Joining me now is former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney. She's the author of the new book, Oath and Honor. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today, and I just want to thank you for speaking out as much as you have, because it's not easy to go against the grain of your party.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And these issues really are ones, as we've talked about, that span across party lines.
I want to start kind of where I ended there, which is about dictators. You have worked around the world. You've worked on national security issues. Are some of these impulses, these authoritarian impulses of Trump's, are they a sign of strength? Are they a sign of weakness, as I said? What are your thoughts?
You know, I think that the first thing I would say is that we have to be very careful that we don't sort of ignore exactly what you're pointing to. Because this is the United States of America, because we've never really had to deal with somebody, we've never had to deal with somebody like this before, it can become too easy to say, well, dictatorship can't happen here. And I think that the really important message of this is that the people who were around him, who stopped the very worst of what he was trying to do, we know will not be around him again. And a second term, therefore, will be far, far more dangerous in terms of his willingness to ignore the rulings of the courts. You know, we've talked about the pardon power and his willingness to use that if he needs to. And the fact that he already tried to stay in office once, he tried to seize power once. So nobody can responsibly say, you know what, he won't do that again. He's fit to be president.
And your book makes that very clear, that we weren't prepared in many ways, and we need to be prepared now. I want to read a part of your book that really stuck out to me. You said, and you've touched on a little bit of this, certainly Donald Trump would run the U.S. government with acting officials who are not and could not be confirmed by the Senate. He would obtain a bogus legal opinion, allowing him to do it. He would ensure the Senate confirmation process is no longer any check on his authority. The types of resignation threats that may have kept Trump at bay before would no longer be a deterrent. Trump would be eager for those who oppose his actions at the Justice Department and elsewhere to resign. And at the Department of Defense, he would again install his own team of loyalists, people who would act on his orders without hesitation. That's a pretty stark assessment. And I think a lot of people are trying to understand what's the biggest risk and what this all means. So what of those things keeps you up at night?
I think, you know, they all do. And what really keeps me up at night is the idea that there are so many people now who seem to have forgotten what he already did once, and who seem not to be focused on how much power we instill in someone as president. And a president who's willing to do the things we've watched him do before certainly will do those things again. I think, you know, the story of the lead up to January 6th and, you know, what he was willing to do, for example, at the Defense Department, the fact that today still he is saying, well, you know, Mike Flynn would be part of a future administration. And Mike Flynn, of course, said he should deploy the military to seize voting machines, to rerun the election. I mean, it really and these are not people that he's distancing himself from. Which, you know, it's an important point. If you look, for example, at the text messages between Sean Hannity and Kayleigh McEnany on January 7th, they were saying no more crazy people. Basically, keep Trump isolated, keep the crazy people away from him. You know, now he's spending all of his time with
surrounding himself.
Steve Bannon, exactly, Mike Flynn and others who would be, you know, at the top of his administration if he were to get a second term.
Which is a group of enablers is something you talk about a fair amount in your book. I did want to ask you, we were talking about pardon power before the show started. And one of the things you talk about in the book is sort of these powers of the presidency that people aren't maybe aware are a little bit unchecked by how the system is set up. There is pardon power. There, of course, is the nuclear codes. There is being able to deploy military.
Right.
Which of those is scariest to you, or what do you think people aren't tracking the most of those powers?
I think that in many ways, all of them share the common thread, which is it doesn't matter how many guardrails you try to put in place if you elect a president who's going to blow through the guardrails. And if you look at the constitutional structure, you know, the presidency is checked according to our framers, by the Congress and by the courts. And we're, of course, now in a situation where, you know, the Republicans that are in the majority in the House, certainly, and many of the Republicans in the Senate, won't check him, won't stand up to him. And then if you know, the courts issue rulings with which he disagrees, has been cleared, and in fact ignored 61 out of 62 court cases that he lost. It's clear that neither one of those other entities will be able to be a check on his power.
To check him. So one of the things you also talk about is how, and you've said this publicly since the book came out, that you think it's hard to stay in office.
Right.
What does that look like? You're so familiar with the powers of the presidency and what enablers could do. How does he do that?
Well, first of all, he tried to do it once. I mean, if you think about when he woke up on the morning of January 6th, he knew that he had lost the election, and yet he thought he was going to remain in the Oval Office. He thought he was going to remain as president after January 20th. And you can imagine a scenario where he could say, for example, you know what, we just need to delay the election, as he's already said previously, and suggest that for some reason, there was incurable fraud, and so the election couldn't go forward, and we should just delay it. And people hear that, and they say, well, but the courts would step in. Certainly a federal court would issue an order saying, no, you have to go forward with the election. But if the president ignores the court's orders, it doesn't matter that they're compulsory. And I think that's the most important thing for people to recognize, is that our system, the framework of our constitutional structure, depends upon individuals to defend it. And the president is, at the pinnacle of those who are duty bound to defend it. So we're in real danger if we elect somebody like Donald Trump who won't.
I do want to turn to the legal cases. You are a lawyer, of course, and you talk about a lot of these in the book. And there was what I think is a surprising but pretty big development today, because Special Prosecutor Jack Smith is now asking the Supreme Court to decide whether Donald Trump is entitled to immunity from criminal prosecution for his alleged crimes committed while in office. It's something that he has raised as a way to kind of delay or get himself, of course, out of the legal case. What did you make of Smith's decision? Is it a wise one? What will it get him?
I thought it was exactly the right thing to do. I think he's clearly demonstrating that Donald Trump's efforts at delay are not ones that he thinks that the court should abide. And I also don't think that it's a close call at all. The notion that somehow a president has got complete immunity for criminal activity that he committed while in office, just strikes me as not a close call. So I thought it was the right decision. And then I think you've seen the Supreme Court move very quickly to say that they'll take the case. Which
is interesting. And in your book, you also tell a story of how back in January of 2022, when the court granted the committee access to Trump's presidential documents, you were a little more, I think, optimistic, it's fair to say, about what they might do. And a lot of people, many Democrats, are skeptical. There's 3 appointees from Trump on there. As you look at this case, it seems like they've moved rapidly. Yeah. How confident are you that they will fully take the case, that they will rule in favor of Jack Smith?
I think it's one of the really heartening things about what's happened over the course of the last several years now, that we've seen, almost without exception, judges and justices. It doesn't matter if they were appointed by a Democratic president or a Republican president. They have been absolutely steadfast in terms of recognizing the threat that Donald Trump poses and upholding the rule of law. And it was very interesting, as you mentioned, on the committee. I think we saw this sort of traditional analysis of the courts, and I think both sides do it. But, the Democrats would say, well, the Republican justices can't be counted on, or the Republican appointed judges or justices, and the Republicans assume, the opposite. And I think it was very important. What we did see was, in every case, the courts understood how important the work of the committee was, understood how important it was that we be able to conduct the investigation in a timely fashion. And so we really were able to do things like get access to the documents on a much quicker timetable than we might have expected.
So we shouldn't be skeptical. People shouldn't be so worried out there.
I mean, I think people should be really understand and be impressed with how our courts and our judges and justices have operated, and but recognize and understand then the damage and the danger that Donald Trump and Republican enablers are doing every time they go out and attack and demonize, either the judges or the special counsel himself. I think it's this notion that somehow the system is weaponized is a really damaging one, and it's wrong.